All right. Everyone get a lesson sheet for tonight? All right. Very good. It's hard to believe we are moving closer to the end of the series and just a couple more lessons to go. But this evening we're going to be looking at the rise of governing by edict rather than rule of law. So we're going to look at that here in a minute. Let's have a word of prayer and get started. Father, I pray you give us wisdom as we go through this information, Lord. As with each of these lessons, we want to do more than just give information. We want to look at the events of history through a biblical worldview and to see the applications that can be made to our lives and how it can impact how we live as citizens of the United States as children of God. So we ask you bless now our time. In Jesus' name, amen. So our subject today is dealing with executive orders. And, I don't know if you have the same perception that I do, that it seems like they're being used more now than ever before. But the fact of the matter is they're not. In about the last 70 years, every president has used a lot of them. And I was surprised when we get down in here, we'll talk a little more about it, to find out which presidents have used the most of them. And but it is very interesting how executive orders are being used has changed. The number of them is in the 20th century is pretty consistent by president with one or two exceptions, but what they're being used for is what's changed. We're going to take a look at that tonight, and I think it's very interesting, and it also is a dangerous trend that we need to be aware of and alert to. Executive orders are a tool that are often used by U.S. presidents to move forward their agendas. An executive order specifically is a directive from the U.S. president that manages the operations of the federal government. Executive orders are not specifically addressed in the Constitution, but they have been used since President George Washington as an administrative tool to move forward the operation of the government. While not legislation, it does carry the force of law behind it, and even often without input from Congress. And that's where some of the problems can arise. It was originally intended for administrative purposes, such as Congress gave to George Washington the ability to have a standing army, but then it was up to him how to organize it. He used executive orders to say, I'm going to have this person in command of the army, we're going to have this person in command of procuring supplies, this one in, and so how it was organized was done by executive order. But the authority to raise the standing army was given by Congress. So the original intent of executive orders was to move forward what Congress authorized. Congress said, we're going to give to the executive branch X number of dollars for the president's keep and for what became the White House, for all the administrative of the White House. Well, then we didn't want Congress saying, and that means you can hire a personal servant, you can hire 3 maids, you can hire a cook. So they didn't go into that minutia. They gave to the president the ability to determine how to hire his staff. And they did that through executive orders. So that's how it came. Originally, its intent was for administrative purposes, but it has morphed over the years into policy making and into law-making territory. And that's where concerns have begun to be raised. The authority to issue executive orders are considered implied powers under the Constitution. In Article 2, the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States of America. Also in Article 2, Section 3, he shall take a great care that the laws be faithfully executed. So that's where they get their authority to do what we call executive orders. Constitutionally, they are interpreted as giving the president the authority to issue directives to manage federal operations, but they do not give him authority to create laws or override laws. That is not found in our Constitution. Many of the executive orders to help with that, when a president issues one, he'll also often cite an act of Congress saying, because Congress did this, I have justification to do this, to sort of strengthen the legal argument for it. Such as the National Emergencies Act. The president will say, because Congress has the National Emergencies Act, I then can do this in a time of war or in a time of national emergency, and so on. Congress says we're going to appropriate funds to build tanks, and the president says, because we're in a war footing area, I'm also going to authorize the building of airplanes, even though Congress didn't specifically say airplanes. So that's one of the ways executive orders have been used. By legal interpretation, they are technically only legal when they align with the powers delegated by Congress or the Constitution. All right, so for the first 150 years of our history, executive orders were primarily used to manage the internal operations of the federal government. They were used to give instructions to the executive branch agencies. They were used to implement laws. Congress said, we've passed a law, and then the executive department would say, and this is how we're going to implement it. And they were used with military and foreign policy matters, especially during wartime or during emergencies. It is interesting to note the scope of executive orders through the last 230 years. From the founding of our country to the 1800s, they were primarily administrative or military organization in scope. And so they were pretty modest in what they did. They absolutely did what Congress intended, what the founders intended, moved forward the operations that had already been authorized. In the 1900s, we saw a change. In World War II was where the biggest change began to happen, where the war powers were assumed by the president, where he did not keep going back to Congress saying, I need more, I need more, I need more, I need different. Once he had the declaration of war, the president took it and ran with it and used executive orders to move forward our war efforts. Economic regulation. It was not Congress who did the gas taxes during World War II, or the rubber taxes, or they had stamps they used and all that rationing. That was actually done by executive order. And so the executive orders changed. They expanded during times of crisis. But that opened, if you will, the Pandora's box. So from the 1900s forward, we begin seeing that the primary use of executive orders is to make policy on areas such as immigration, climate, and civil rights. So they've completely morphed. Began in administration, it moved into war powers, and now it's setting policy. And so it's used as a legislative substitute. Instead of waiting for Congress to debate something, a president implements it. He just moves forward, says, I was elected with a mandate, this is what I'm doing. And away he goes. Sometimes we look at that and say that was a good move. Other times you look at it and say it wasn't a good move. Sometimes there's legal challenges. Sometimes there's not. So we've seen in the 21st century presidents bypassing Congress over and over and over again because of legislative gridlock, to push their agenda through without congressional approval. Now they often serve as political statements. I firmly believe that the current administration many of the executive orders that he did were done to poke the bear. I really do. I think that he knew a lot of them would not stand, but he wanted to poke the bear at his political opponents. And so he wrote some that he knew would cheese them off, right? And I mean, it was political gamesmanship on some of them. Sadly, that then there's so many of that type that then it weakens the power of the ones that I believe he was serious about. It dilutes their effectiveness because they all get lumped together. And and then also the other thing the presidents do is they use executive orders to reverse the executive order of the previous president. And, so then it gets complicated. Is it law today? Well, today it is, but tomorrow won't be, and maybe next year it'll be again. It's hard to know. And so some of that can be just political gamesmanship. Because the executive orders bypass Congress, they are often subject to legal challenges. And we're, of course, seeing some of that going on right now in our country. Courts often intervene to determine whether an executive order is constitutional or whether it has exceeded constitutional authority given to the executive branch. So how can an executive order be overruled? It can be overruled by Congress. Congress can say, we're going to pass a law that counteracts an executive order. Now, of course, if they do that, they better have a veto-proof majority or it'll be a moot point, right? So that would probably only happen if it was a supermajority in both houses that was opposite of the president, which we have seen happen before. We saw in the second term of President Obama that both houses were under control of the Republican Party, and so President Obama's agenda basically got stopped, and because they had enough votes that they were able to overrule much of what he tried to move forward. So we do see that happen periodically, though not often. Congress can also use budgetary controls to limit enforcement. You say, well, that's a grand idea, but how are you going to pay for it, President? Mr. President, we have the purse strings. So, yeah, you can have that written down, but we're not going to release any money. And so that's another way they sometimes can bypass executive orders from being enforced. And then, of course, the Supreme Court itself can strike them down. Yes? So Congress can pass legislation to override an executive order. But, yeah, that's why I said, but they have to have a veto-proof majority because that law is subject to presidential veto. So that's only effective if they have enough majority that they can overrule. No, I'm saying they can overrule a president if they have a big enough majority to bypass a veto. Yeah, all right? Sorry if I wasn't clear on that. And then, of course, the Supreme Court can strike down executive orders as well. So in the past 60 years, the trend has been that the presidents are more and more using executive orders to bypass Congress, leading many to call this governing by edict. That sure does not sound like what our framers intended when they set up the three branches of government in our Constitution. Their increased scope and their unilateral nature poses grave concerns about the checks and balances that were set up by our founders for our government. So what we want to do tonight is look at this trend in our government of executive orders and then view it through the lens of a biblical worldview and see how the biblical principles of governance according to law, the importance of the rule of law, and how believers ought to respond in these kind of situations. All right? One of the things we have to be careful of, and it's so easy for us to do this, myself included, is to have the my guy not my guy mentality. We've referred to that a couple times in recent days. Even if a president does an executive order that you happen to like, we need to be intellectually honest enough if it violates if there's a constitutional challenge and it violates it, we ought to be intellectually honest enough to say, that was a bad one. We don't be so blinded by political agenda that we like everything our guy does and hate everything the other guy does, right? So we want to make sure that we're looking at these things through that lens of what's right. Not what's expedient, not what favors me, not what favors my party, but what is right. What's the right thing to do? And that's important. So we're going to, in the front half, we're going to be loaded up on information. Then we'll do more application in the latter half of the lesson. So let's take a look at some of the notable examples of executive orders. Surprisingly enough, the president who has more executive orders than any other in our history is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Over 1,300 executive orders. That compares to President Trump's first term, 320. So, think of the sheer volume of that. 1,320 executive orders. But well over 80% of those dealt with World War II. They were dealing with the emergency of moving the war effort forward. All right? So they had a specific purpose in that regard that was unique because we were in a time of war. Some of them were essential. Some were necessary. Some of the rationing for the war effort helped move the war effort forward. But there were some that we look back with the lens of hindsight, and we look at it and say, man, this violated some people's basic rights. The internment of Japanese American citizens. We were guilty of that, and that was done by executive order. And it's easy for us to look backward at it and say, wow, that sure was an injustice. The hard part, though, is how do you deal with it? I don't know what, Brother Gunn, I don't know what a better answer would have been. Do you have enemy combatants inside your own borders? How do you know? How are you going to deal with them? On a smaller scale, a lot of Germans were also oppressed during this time, but because they physically resembled more European Americans, many of them were able to fly under the radar, where obviously Japanese, there was a physical appearance, and so they were more easily identified. And the internment, when we look at that in hindsight, wow, some grave injustice is done. And I think some of the worst part of it was that though they were interned, even though they were guilty of no crime, they also, in a vast majority of cases, lost all of their assets. And when they were eventually released, they were now homeless, penniless, and had no recourse. That was all moved forward by a wartime executive order under FDR. Its impact was huge. Over 100,000 American citizens and residents were forcibly relocated. And we look back at it and say this was a huge violation of civil liberties. All right, but that's one of the notable ones that FDR did. Another executive order that's notable was by Harry Truman. This one we look at and we say, wow, he was ahead of his time. We just 2 weeks ago dealt with the civil rights movement in the 1960s. It was in 1948 that President Truman desegregated the U.S. military. And that created quite a fervor and fury, I'll get the word spit out, controversy. Bail on the word. All right. That we look backwards at, and we see that generally is seen as a positive use of an executive order. But that was a significant executive order in our history. President Obama One of his most significant ones was the DACA executive order. This is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Very controversial, but a very impactful. Controversial because it bypassed Congress. There were specific laws in Congress on immigration, and he bypassed those laws. And because in this case it was not creating a new policy, he was actually countermanding written law. The DACA was challenged in court by Congress, and many parts of the DACA provisions were deemed to be unconstitutional and were struck down. Some parts withstood the scrutiny, but many of them did not. All right. So there was a partial rollback that has occurred from that. Another significant one under President Biden was the Advancing Racial Equity executive order he signed. This required federal agencies to assess equity in their operations, and it was criticized by some as overreach, praised by others as social justice. It gave rise to what became to be known as DEI programs. You heard that in the news recently? So what's happened in the current administration? By executive order, he said, no, we're reversing it. And now people are suing, saying, well, it's already in place, you can't sue. And the President Trump's response is, wait a minute, no, it wasn't passed by Congress, it was by an executive order. And I have the right to reverse executive orders. The same right he had to put it in place, I have the right to remove it. And that's why that is standing. It's creating a lot of uproar, but so far it's withstood legal challenge because Congress did not say, this is so important, we're going to pass a law. They didn't. If they felt it was that important, they should have passed a law. They did not do that. So President Trump has said, I don't like it, I'm reversing it. And that's why that's happened. There are some significant executive orders through history that have been overturned or been blocked. One of the most significant, when I just finished reading a biography on Truman by what was his name? McCormick. McCormick's biography on Truman. It was a fascinating read on this particular one. During the Korean War, there was a huge steelworker strike that was about ready to go into force. They were ready to vote on it, and it was going to happen. And President Truman argued that the war effort required them to have steel for tanks, for ships, for armaments, for airplanes, for all the things necessary to push that war forward, and that this strike would impede our nation's ability to fight. This went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court overturned the executive order because they had never actually declared war. I wasn't around then. I know some of you were, that the Korean War was called a police action. It was never actually a war. It was prosecuted as an executive order. So because it was prosecuted as an executive order, Congress gave its tacit assent by releasing funds, but because they never had a formal declaration of war, he did not have the legal authority under the War Powers Act that President FDR had used. He did not have the power to nationalize our steel production because it was not actually a declared war. So the Supreme Court said, you don't have the authority, and threw it out. And that then, it actually brought the two parties back to the bargaining table, and they were able to resolve the strike at the bargaining table with pressure from the president. But that was considered an unconstitutional example of an executive order that had grave overreach beyond what it should have had. Another one that was reversed by the Supreme Court was the President Trump's travel ban in 2017. American citizens, many of them, were stuck in other parts of the country, other parts of the world, because they had foreign heritage. and many of them were forbidden, who were in America, from getting on an airplane and traveling to another part of the country because they had a name or a heritage of a foreign nature. And there were many, many cases of that where it had nothing to do with being on any kind of a terrorist list or any kind of an association with terrorism, but simply because their name was added to a list because of their racial heritage. And that primarily it dealt with Muslim countries, people who are coming from Muslim countries traveling. There was one case of an entire airplane worth of people who were flying from northern Africa back to the States, who got diverted because of mechanical difficulties, landed in Saudi Arabia to take care of mechanical issues, and the entire plane was denied entrance to the U.S. It had nothing to do with them having any connection to terrorism. So that law that executive order faced multiple challenges, and the Supreme Court reversed some big pieces of it, but did allow a revised version of it to stand that was scaled back. Another one that's along the same line, in 2014, President Obama had the what they called the DAPA Act, Deferred Action for Parents of Americans. This had to do with foreigners, mostly illegal aliens, who had children born in America, so-called anchor babies. And that would allow a mother to stay in the U.S. if she had a child born in the U.S. This executive order that allowed that was blocked by the courts. The Supreme Court deadlocked 4-4 in 2016, effectively ending it. Another one was President Biden canceled virtually every permit related to Alaskan pipelines in 2021, revoking Trump-era permits, which were given under executive order. Again, had Congress passed a law, it wouldn't have been an issue, but because it was done as an executive order, President Biden reversed it. And but in that case, because Congress would not overturn it directly, there were lawsuits and state actions that followed, which overturned many of its provisions. The Biden administration effectively kept it in force, however, by the purse strings. They would slow walk permit applications. They withdrew from federal lands, all federal lands, from any gas or oil exploration and approval of leases and so on. So then, of course, one of the very first executive orders by the current Trump administration was to overturn the restrictions from the previous. You see how unstable this makes life in our country when it's all based on who's in charge, which direction the law. So today it's legal, but tomorrow it's illegal. And having that mentality of, well, my guy's in charge, so we better get all we can while we can, because as soon as the next guy's in there, we're going to lose it all. That's not an effective way to govern a nation. It's just not. It creates huge turmoil. It creates tremendous amounts of animosity, and it leaves a lot of innocent people hurt in its wake, just because of the flip-flopping of policies. So let's look at some application now. All right, we've given you information. Now let's look at application. How should we view executive orders from a biblical perspective? The way we should, in talking with, because it comes up in water cooler conversation, we know it does. So how should we deal with it? Rather than focusing, especially if you have an acquaintance or a neighbor or somebody who may be wanting to talk about the executive orders because they want to sort of poke at you with it, because they know this might be, quote, your guy, all right? Turn the conversation to your support of law and order and saying, I wish our president would have gone to Congress. I wish Congress would spend more time thinking about the good of America rather than about their personal reelection and making money on the back of Americans. How can you go to Congress with total assets of $100,000 from a house you own and leave Congress 12 years later with $20 million in the bank? How does that happen on a $200,000 a year salary? They're enriching themselves rather than being servants of the people. And we need to change the focus on our support for lawful government, because that's what God intends us to do. And talk about it that way. It's God's design that we have a lawful government. God is a God of order, not of tyranny. 1 Corinthians 14:40, let all things be done decently and in order. Okay? Rather than getting into an argument with somebody over the merits of an executive order, agree with them that you wish we did things properly through Congress. So you know what? So you and I could be on opposite sides of this debate and have a debate about it and have a vote on it, just like we do in the elections of our representatives. And then the will of the people would be enforced. That's the way God intended government to be. That's the way our founders intended government to be. Let all things be done decently in order. Do you think it's decent and in order to have this president reverse the last president's executive orders, and he reverses the previous president's executive orders, and he reverses Is that decent and in order? No, it's not. That's chaotic. That's tumultuous.
What you find a lot of places, Katie and I got trapped once in the Caribbean. One pilot ran out of gas, literally, with the airplane.
Wow.
And they weren't selling any gas.
Ah.
So we were
You're stuck.
distributing gas, and after a couple hours they got tired and settled it.
Wow.
You don't have much to say.
Right.
Your language and other things.
God values lawful, orderly systems, right? God is the one who instituted civil government. And it is God's intent that civil government promote justice and restrain evil. That's his purpose. Look what Romans 13 says about government. Let every soul be subject to the higher powers, for there's no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever resisteth the power resisteth the ordinance of God. Rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. We're told to be subject not only for wrath, but for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also. Do any of you know, I personally know a couple, do any of you know people who say, because I'm a Christian, I don't pay taxes because they won't use the taxes right? All right? There are people like that. And they use the fact that they're a Christian as justification not to pay taxes, because they say the taxes are going to an immoral government. When Romans 13 was written, what kind of government was Paul the Apostle living under? The Roman government was not an elected government. It was an occupation government in Israel. They didn't elect them. It was a war government imposed on them. Paul didn't say, resist the government, withhold your taxes. He said, pay your taxes. Yeah, be subject to them. Render, therefore, to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. That's Romans 13. All right? That's how we're supposed to, as Christians, to address it. The role of law in Scripture is very clear. Deuteronomy 17. It shall be, speaking of the king, when he sitteth upon his throne, he shall write him a copy of the law in a book out of that which is before the priests, the Levites. God said, I want every king to actually handwrite out the book of the law. I want them to personally write a copy for themselves. All right? and it shall be with him, and he shall read it therein all the days of his life. Why? That he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and keep the words of this law and these statutes to do them. Why? That his heart be not lifted above his brethren. You know, the us and them mentality. I'm better than you are because I got elected and you didn't, right? Yeah, God said, if you will write a copy of the law, keep it by him, read it every day, then he won't be lifted up above his brethren, that he turn not aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, to the end that he might prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. The kings were to write and to read the law of God daily, and even they, as leaders, were subject to God's law. That's God's intent. That's God's intent. Isaiah 10 says, woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees. Okay? So what are we talking about? We're talking about it's God's design that there be accountability in leadership. And the entire notion of the way executive orders are being used today bypasses that accountability. It does. Nathan confronted David. You remember that in 2 Samuel 12? He gave him a parable about someone who stole his poor neighbor's sheep and was using that parable to get David's ire rankled because David had been a shepherd. And his righteousness got indignated, and he was fierce in his judgment. He said that man needs to be, tell me his name, I'm going to go after him. He is not only going to repay 4 sheep for the one he stole, but his life is forfeit. He's going to die for this. Then Nathan the prophet looked at David and said, thou art the man. Uriah the Hittite had 1 wife, and you took her, and you killed him. You had your pick of women of the nation. By this time, he already had well over 15 wives and concubines, maybe 16. He had his pick of women, but he took this one woman by deceit and then killed her husband. He deserved to die, all right? God was saying to David, just because you are the law doesn't mean you're above the law. There's accountability for you too. Acts 5:29, as those under the law, the apostles said, when we come to a conflict, we must serve God rather than man. So they are saying there are some lines we won't cross. We will serve God rather than man. But they were also willing to receive the punishment that came from that decision. Right? And they did. They were beaten for it. Civil disobedience, essentially, is what we would call it today. When human authority defies God's laws, sometimes God's people have to stand and say, I won't bow here. I won't bend. So, when we see with executive orders overreach, okay, when we see it happen, how should we respond to it? There is a biblical way for us to respond. Here's some things. First of all, pray for your leaders. Please notice that I said pray for them, not about them. Sadly, there are some people who take almost a perverse pleasure in invoking in prayer wrath on their political opponents. That's not God's heart. You remember one time there were some people that rejected Jesus Christ, one of the villages. Pastor Scott mentioned this a few weeks ago in our study in Luke. And when Christ went into one of the villages, they rejected them because they had their face set as if they were going towards Jerusalem. And the Samaritan village would not receive them because they were headed towards Jerusalem. And so Jesus said, all right, fine, we'll go this way. We'll go and cross the river Jordan, and we'll go down the east side and come back across. And as they're walking away, the disciples were just full of indignation. They said, Lord, Should we call down fire from heaven on them like Elijah the prophet did? I mean, they wanted, please, give me the power just once. Just Zots, Yeah, that's what they wanted. And Jesus turned to the disciples and said, you know not what spirit you are of. And they were getting all consumed with personal, with anger and wanting revenge on behalf of Christ. So you know not what spirit you are. That's not how I treat my enemies. Jesus wanted every soul in that Samaritan village to receive him as Savior. That's what he wanted. He wasn't looking to cast brimstone on their heads. All right? We need to be careful not to have that attitude towards our enemies, towards political opponents. We need to pray for our leaders. Tomorrow is National Day of Prayer. If you can come, I encourage you to. We'll meet at 8:30 out front in front of the flagpoles. We are going to pray for our leaders. Can I tell you, I pray by name on my prayer list for Governor Tina Kotek. I pray by name for Representative Ruiz, who represents the district our church is in. I pray by name for Zach Hudson, who represents the district where my house is. I pray by name for Senator Chris Gorsuch, who is the senator out here in Gresham. Pray by name for our president, for our congressional representatives. We need to pray for our leaders. They need God's help. They need it. And God can turn even the thoughts and the ideas of ungodly and unsaved kings to his will. The Bible tells us that. But he does it in response to prayer. 1 Timothy 2 says, pray for kings and for all that are in authority. Paul was saying to these Christians, I know the emperor is coming after you, so pray for him. Yeah, pray for him. That's what he told them to do. Prayer is the first step in addressing our national issues as Christians. That's where we begin. You got to begin with a heart of prayer. Then, you've maybe heard the phrase before, but I think it's appropriate. Speak truth to power. What do we mean by that? Proverbs 31, open thy mouth for the dumb. Speak up for those who can't speak. Speak up. The unborn do not have a voice unless those who are living speak for them. And you speak up. Christians are called to be voices for justice, advocating for lawful and righteous governance. That's what we're called to do. We need to uphold the rule of law. I am so grateful that our church supports our first responders and our police. What a blessing it was to see our church honor those police officers last Sunday. When we provided the dinner and we sat down and ate with them, they expressed their thanks because they don't get a lot of thank yous in our society. They don't. And it meant a lot to them. It meant a lot to them. We need to support our leaders who support the Constitution and who support the legislative process. We need to support them. I had opportunity a couple months ago to meet with our Senator Gorsuch. And one of the things I appreciate about him, and I told him, is that he broke ranks with his party to bring an issue to open debate in the Senate that could have been pushed through without debate. Because even though he was in support of a bill, which, by the way, I wasn't, I didn't support the bill, but I appreciated the fact he was insistent that debate happen. That's the right thing to do in our form of government. And rather than keep it hidden under the cloak of secrecy and push it through as a line item attached to something else and pass it under the cover of darkness, he said, let's bring it out into the open and debate it. Now, it's still passed. I wish it hadn't, but knowing the political dynamics of Salem. I understand why it did, but I appreciated that he was vocal for the debate happening. And I told him that. I thanked him for that. All right? So we need to support those in the areas. Now, there's areas I can support him in. I told him how grateful I was for his working to keep Mount Hood Hospital open when they wanted to close it. When my daughter was pregnant, when my daughter-in-law was pregnant, and they were closing the maternity ward there, Senator Gorsuch had a lot to do with that being reopened and kept open. I told him I thank you for that. Where I can support him, I will. And tell him that. We need to be that. We need to do that. All right? Not be so partisan, as I say, because you're not of the same party I am, I can't support anything you do. If you say it's black, it has to be white. That gut reaction that often people have. We need to educate others on civics and the importance of checks and balances. That's the way we ought to approach it. Okay? And then we need to stand against unbiblical mandates. There are times we've got to stand up. Many of you were here in 2020 when we stood up. When our president said we want to try and slow down and stop the spread of this COVID that we didn't know anything about yet, he said, I'm asking everyone to stay home for 2 weeks. Asking churches, please stay home for the next 2 weeks. We honored our president and said, we'll do it because he asked us to. So we did online church only for those 2 weeks. And then our governor came out and said, we want to extend that because it's not slowing down, it's getting bigger. So we want to keep the crowds to 10 people or less. And so we weren't happy about it, but we kept it. We're just the pastors and our production staff, and some of you remember that. We did broadcasts for a few more weeks. And then one day, if you remember, a protest happened on the Burnside Bridge. 15,000 people linked arm in arm. They were not observing 6-foot social distancing. They were not wearing masks. They were linked arm in arm, body pressed against body, singing and chanting in protest against our police. And they blocked the Burnside Bridge and laid down on it. And when a reporter asked Governor Brown at the time, asked Governor Brown, aren't you concerned about this violating the mandates you've put out about social distancing and the spread of COVID? And her response was, their First Amendment protections for freedom of expression are more important at this moment. The very next day, I helped Pastor Adams craft the letter that he hand-walked into our mayor and that we mailed to our sheriff and that we mailed to our governor, saying we're going back to church Sunday. Because the First Amendment also says Congress will not abridge the right of religion to have free exercise thereof. If protesters can lay arm in arm in violation of these mandates on a bridge blocking traffic, God's people can be in church. If that's considered essential, church is essential. And we are back in church the next Sunday. All right? Now, yeah, we try to do it with wisdom. You're right, Brother Mike, we did. And though we didn't want to be foolish about it. We actually were more wise than those protesters were, because if you remember, when you came in the auditorium that next week, every pew, the first pew had a strip of green tape about 10 feet long on one end, and with a gap in the middle and one on the other end, and then the next one had it in the middle. And we asked people to only sit in the green areas and only sit with family. So, so they kept them separated in the auditorium. And because that limited our seating in the auditorium, we then set up chairs in the gym. And we broadcast the auditorium service onto a screen here in the gym. And so we did it. I mean, we tried to be wise in how we implemented it. We didn't want to kill anybody. But that's when we said there does come a time you need to make a stand. Well, the comments we did, yes, we did. But we also got a lot of support.
Was there any pushback from fishing?
The very first Sunday, that first week when we announced we were coming back, when I pulled in the driveway, I saw a police car sitting in the back over here, and I thought, oh no, here we go. And we're like, how are we what's gonna happen? We didn't know. I went into the office and I told Pastor Adams there's a police officer sitting in our back parking lot, and so he called the other staff in, and there were a couple men here already, and we prayed. We gathered in his office and we prayed that there would not be an issue, because we believed this is what God wanted us to do. And right about then, Matt Willard got here, and I said to Brother Matt, I said, do you see that officer back there? And he said, yeah. I said, would you go talk to him for us? Because Matt has some family who's been in law enforcement. He's been in law enforcement in the past. So he walked back there, and it turned out to be somebody he used to serve with. And he said, the sheriff sent me to make sure you guys were not harassed. Yeah. So I mean, we were worried, but he was actually there for our protection. It was the Romans 13 happening for us. We didn't even know it. The sheriff had sent him over and said, I want you to go over to Greater Portland, make sure no one harasses them for being in church. Yeah. So yeah, God honored it. And we actually had the government here, and we saw that impacted things in the community, because we know of at least one person who showed up with the intention of creating an issue because they said something on our live stream, who left because they saw the police officer. So we saw God protect us. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. So we saw that. Sometimes you've got to make a stand, right? But even when you do it with grace. We were not belligerent. We gave the biblical reasons why, and why we believe church was essential. And we took a stand. And that's what we did. So the biblical response to overreach: pray for your leaders. Talk about what's going on. Use biblical principles when you talk about them. When someone asks you about what your opinion is on one of these executive orders, whether you agree with it or not, take it back to, even if it's one you agree with, I wish he'd have gone to Congress and made Congress act, because that's the way our Constitution is set up. I wish our last president would have done the same. And even if you're in support of it or you're not support of it, the fact of the matter is this is not the way to govern it, because the next president is going to reverse everything this president did. That's not good for our country. Our country needs to be run on laws passed by Congress. And just focus the attention there. That's how we ought to respond. Okay? So as we wrap it up, the use of governing by executive order reveals that our government leaders are ineffective or unwilling to stand and be counted. They don't want to face heat at home, so they won't stand and be counted. So they let the president take the heat. That's what's happening. The answer for God's people in response to this trend of ruling by edict is educate yourself and talk to others about the rule of law and the need for righteous leadership. We need to then vote for leaders who will take a stand for the rule of law and constitutional adherence. And then we need to stay informed, but more importantly, stay grounded in God's word. If you are spending more time with Fox News than you are with God's word, you're a little out of balance. You need to be grounded in God's word. That's where we need to be grounded. We are called to be salt and light. We influence society with truth, not with argument. All right? That's what Jesus said, Matthew 5, ye are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has lost its savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is therefore good for nothing but to be cast out and be trodden under foot of men. He goes on to say, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. Okay? Yes? Right. Yeah. One of the biblical statements out there is to be as wise as a serpent but harmless as a dove. I don't know if you remember that, but in Oregon, the governor said, yes, 25 people can be in church, but only 6 can be in your home for Thanksgiving. And she actually encouraged people to tell on each other, right? Like 1984, to report it. So what we decided to do was have church on Thanksgiving Day in our home. 23 family members, and we had church first. We sang, we read scriptures, we prayed, we gave testimonies, then we ate. And as my wife said, it was wonderful. Probably the best Thanksgiving we'd ever had. Yeah, so wise as serpent, harmless as doves, right? Amen. All right. Next time, we're going to begin wrapping some things up. We're going to talk about how lessons from the past give warnings for the future. I was working on that today, doing some study on that, and the Bible is full of examples of where God gives a warning, and when it's not followed, there's consequences. In our nation, we have many of our founding fathers who gave warnings, said this will only work if this occurs. And when it doesn't, and we don't follow those warnings, there's dire consequences. And we reap that. We're going to talk about that in our next lesson. All right? Thank you for your faithfulness tonight. I appreciate it. God bless you. We're dismissed.